Step into the unknown with Serenity Valley Stories. Remember to like and subscribe, if you wish to hear more. And now our feature presentation, The Spirit of Katahdin. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the log walls of the old cabin. I rocked gently in my chair, the creak of the wood beneath me a familiar sound. My grandchildren, Emily and Jake, sat cross-legged on the floor, their faces lit by the warm glow of the flames. They'd asked for a story, a real one, they insisted, not just some fairy tale. I looked at them for a long moment, considering. They were still young, still full of that innocent curiosity that made them fearless. But there were things in this world they needed to be wary of, things that lurked in the places where the light didn't reach. "All right," I said finally, leaning forward slightly in my chair. "I'll tell you a story, but it's not one of those make-believe tales. This one's real, and it happened to me many years ago." Their eyes widened in anticipation, and I felt a pang of something, fear, maybe, or regret, at the thought of passing this burden on to them. But they needed to know. They needed to understand. "This was back when I was about your age, Jake," I began, my voice soft but steady. "I was living in a small town in Maine, not far from here. It was a place much like this one, quiet, surrounded by forests and mountains. And it was there that I first heard the stories of Pamola." I paused, letting the name hang in the air for a moment. The fire crackled, and a log shifted, sending up a burst of sparks. Pamola was a creature of legend, the spirit of Mount Katahdin. The Penobscot people, who had lived in those woods long before any of us, believed that Pamola was the guardian of the mountain, a fearsome being with the head of a moose, the body of a man, and the wings and talons of a great bird. They said he could control the weather, summon storms, and that he was fiercely protective of his territory. Anyone who ventured too far up the mountain risked his wrath. Jake leaned in closer, his eyes wide. "Did you see him, Grandpa?" I nodded slowly, my gaze distant as the memories came flooding back. "Yes, Jake. I saw him. And I've never forgotten it. It was late in the summer of 1952, and I had just turned 15. I was a restless boy back then, always looking for adventure, always eager to prove myself. The mountains and forests were my playground, and I knew them like the back of my hand. But there was one place I'd never been, Mount Katahdin. The mountain loomed large in the distance, its jagged peaks often shrouded in mist. The locals avoided it, muttering about bad omens and strange disappearances. But I was young and foolish, and I didn't believe in old superstitions. So one day, I decided to climb it. I set out early in the morning, the sun just beginning to peek over the horizon. I told my parents I was going fishing and packed a small bag with some provisions, a loaf of bread, some cheese, and a canteen of water. I also brought along my father's old hunting knife, just in case. The first part of the hike was uneventful. The air was crisp, the forest alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. I followed a narrow trail that wound its way up the lower slopes of the mountain, my heart pounding with excitement. But as I climbed higher, the forest began to change. The trees grew thicker, their branches intertwining to form a dense canopy that blocked out the sun. The air grew colder, the ground beneath my feet damp and slippery. And then the sounds of the forest began to fade away, leaving only the whisper of the wind and the occasional creak of a tree branch. I pressed on, determined to reach the summit. But as I rounded a bend in the trail, I came across something that made me stop in my tracks. It was a clearing, small and circular, surrounded by trees that were blackened and twisted, as if they had been struck by lightning. The ground was scorched, and the air was thick with the smell of sulfur. In the center of the clearing stood a stone altar, old and weathered, with strange symbols carved into its surface. I felt a chill run down my spine, and for the first time that day, I felt a flicker of doubt. But I was too far in to turn back, and my pride wouldn't let me quit. So I stepped into the clearing, my footsteps echoing in the unnatural silence. As I approached the altar, I felt the air grow colder still, and a sense of foreboding settled over me like a heavy blanket. I reached out to touch the stone, but as soon as my fingers brushed against it, a deafening roar filled the air. I stumbled back, my heart racing, as the sky above me darkened. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, and the ground began to shake. I looked up, and that's when I saw him, Pamola. He was massive, his wings stretching out across the sky, blotting out the sun. His head was that of a moose, his eyes burning with a fierce, unnatural light. His body was that of a man, muscular and covered in dark feathers, and his talons were as sharp as knives. He hovered above me, his wings beating the air with a sound like thunder, and I knew in that moment that the stories were true. Pamola was real, and I had trespassed on his domain. I turned and ran, my feet slipping on the uneven ground, the wind whipping at my face. I could hear Pamola behind me, his roar echoing through the forest, the sound of his wings growing louder as he gave chase. The trail twisted and turned, the trees closing in around me, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like they would give out, but still, I kept going, driven by sheer terror. Finally, I burst out of the forest and onto the lower slopes of the mountain. The wind died down, and the sky began to clear, but I didn't dare look back. I ran all the way home, not stopping until I was safely inside the house, the door locked behind me. My parents were furious, of course, but I didn't care. I was just glad to be alive. I never told them what had really happened on the mountain that day, and I never went back. But I knew that Pamola was still out there, watching, waiting. I glanced at Emily and Jake, their faces pale, their eyes wide with fear. "That's why you need to be careful," I said quietly. "The mountains and forests around here are beautiful, but they're also wild, untamed. And there are things out there, things like Pamola, that don't take kindly to intruders." Jake swallowed hard, his bravado gone. "But, Grandpa, you got away, didn't you?" I nodded slowly. "Yes, Jake, I got away. But I was lucky. And I wouldn't count on luck if I were you." Emily, always the more sensitive one, scooted closer to me, her voice trembling. "Do you think he's still out there?" I looked at the fire, the flames dancing in the hearth, and thought about all the years that had passed since that day on Mount Katahdin. I was older now, wiser, but the memory of that encounter was as vivid as ever. "Yes," I said finally, my voice low. "I do. Pamola is still out there, guarding his mountain, just as he always has. And if you're smart, you'll give him the respect he deserves. Stay away from Katahdin, and don't go looking for trouble, because if you do, you might not be as lucky as I was." The cabin fell silent, the only sound the crackling of the fire. My grandchildren huddled closer together, their faces thoughtful, their eyes full of the gravity of what I'd told them. I knew they would remember this night, this story. And I hoped that it would be enough to keep them safe, to keep them from venturing too far into the wild places where Pamola and other spirits like him still roamed. As I watched the flames flicker and dance, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The world had changed so much since that summer day in 1952, but some things remained the same. The mountains were still there, as ancient and mysterious as ever, and Pamola was still out there, watching, waiting. And though I had escaped him once, I knew that not everyone was so fortunate. The legends were full of stories of those who had ventured too far, who had ignored the warnings and paid the price. And as long as Pamola roamed the skies above Katahdin, there would always be more stories, more warnings. I reached out and pulled Emily and Jake closer, feeling the warmth of their small bodies against mine. "Remember what I've told you," I said softly. "And be careful. The world is full of wonders, but it's also full of dangers. And some of those dangers are best left undisturbed." They nodded, their eyes wide and solemn, and I knew that they understood. The fire crackled in the hearth, and the wind howled softly outside, but inside the cabin, we were safe, for now. But as I looked into the flames, I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, out there in the darkness, Pamola was watching, waiting for the next foolish soul to venture too far into his domain. And I prayed that my grandchildren would never be that foolish soul. Thank you for watching Serenity Valley Stories. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another scary tale. Share your thoughts in the comments below.